So I think I will wait just a moment before we get started to give people a little bit of time to join. I see that there are 18 participants and we hope to have a few more. Why don't I wait 1 minute? Okay, well, in the interest of time, I think I'll go ahead and start. First, I'd like to welcome everybody to the speaker series on the US-Mexico bilateral relationship. And on behalf of the Office of Public Affairs of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico and the U.S.-Mexico Commission for Educational and Cultural Exchanges, I am pleased to welcome you to this is the third of the lectures in this series. This one is on migration. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I'm sure that you will have many questions and find it an interesting discussion. This is an effort of the Department of State's Study Abroad Office to promote the interest in Mexico and the bilateral relationship by giving you exposure to a select and outstanding group of Mexican scholars. Today, we're very lucky, and we have the privilege and honor of hosting Dr. Silvia Giorguli, the president and the first woman to hold this position of the prestigious Colegio de Mexico, or Colmex, as it's popularly known. She's a distinguished and recognized scholar focusing on international migration from Mexico to the United States and its impact on education and on the families on both sides of the border. She holds an undergraduate degree in sociology from Mexico's National Autonomous University and a doctoral degree from Brown. We are proud to have her among our Fulbright-García Robles alumni, as well as a board of directors member of the U.S.-Mexico Commission for Educational and Cultural Exchange, otherwise known as COMEXUS. We thank you for your interest and participation in learning more about Mexico, our neighbors, commercial partners, and friends, and the most important bilateral relationship of the United States. And this year, it celebrates the bicentennial on December 12th. The U.S.-Mexico relationship is unique and possibly one of the most important worldwide, not only because of our extended border, but because of the many factors that bring us together. And thank you, Dr. Giorguli, for being with us this afternoon. Everybody out there in the audience, we encourage you to consider Mexico as an academic destination and hope to see you here soon. We appreciate your interest and thank you for joining us today. And we hope that you'll join us for the remaining 4 lectures that are part of this series. And I hope also that you'll encourage others to join you as well. I think it'll be a really important series to learn more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Winifred, for this introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. As Winifred mentioned, I studied my PhD at Brown University as a Fulbright COMEXUS fellow. And well, for me, it's also an opportunity to talk about my research topic. And as Winnie already mentioned, it's international migration. I mainly have worked on Mexico-US migration. And what I'm going to try to do along this presentation is to present the narrative from a Mexican perspective. No, I know that international migration is a very controversial issue. It's usually crossed by political discussions, by other events such as the war or as the pandemic. But what I will try to do is first to show it from a not the 2022 perspective, but try to look at it in a longer perspective. And the other issue is how does it look from Mexico, being in Mexico, how does the migration issue looks like? Of course, that it's such a complex phenomenon and it has so many dimensions that I selected just some of them. I should add, I am a demographer, so I'm also bringing some data. And after having said that, I'm going to share my screen with the presentation that I prepared for today. Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the other side of the migration story. How does migration looks like when we are in Mexico? And I think that it's especially important to have this discussion in the current context when we're thinking about the management of many dimensions of daily life, but one of them, migration after COVID-19. And I always like to start with this slide because it shows that, or it illustrates that we're talking about a very complex phenomenon that involves many flows. In the media, every day we see and we listen about especially certain flows. But in fact, when you look at it from a larger picture, Mexico-US migration, or the flows between both countries, first imply a set of other countries, and I would say mainly Canada and the northern triangle of Central America, which is Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And it involves different flows in different directions. Of course, you have Mexicans moving to US, and most of the research in Mexico along the story of social sciences in the last decade has concentrated on Mexicans moving to the US. Mexicans moving to the US, documented and undocumented. Migrants moving from US to Mexico, and from this topic, probably there's less research, of course, return migration, which has been historical, but also the migration of US citizens to Mexico, and I will show some data about that I think is interesting. Thirdly, in-transit migration, which is not new in Mexico, but we have seen a large increase in the last 10 years. Mainly from Central America, migrants coming to Mexico from Central America, either as in-transit migrants, but in some cases, not many as I will show, but also in some cases, looking for asylum or for refuge here in Mexico, and in a mixture of economic and environmental migration, violence-driven migration, migrants looking for labor opportunities in Mexico, etc. And the others that we have seen also an increase in the last years is the migration to Mexico or through Mexico from other countries outside this system. That would be, for example, migration coming from, not coming from Haitian migration, but not necessarily coming from Haiti, but coming from other South American countries, African migration, Venezuelan migration, and most recently, also an increase of other flows, such as those coming from Russia and Ukraine. So from the Mexican perspective, you have a set of flows converging here in the country. And I try to disentangle and talk about the most important ones, no? For example, I will start talking about those moving north, and mainly Mexicans moving to the north. And first, we have to take into account that US is and will continue to be a strong magnet for international migrants worldwide, not only Mexico. Now, if you look at the projections, there are projections elaborated by Jeff Ossell. Migration to the US, we can expect migration to the US to continue in the medium term, from not only from Mexico, but from other countries and from other, even from outside the continent, not such as Asian migration. But what happens when we look particularly at Mexican migrants to the US? And I like this slide very much because it's more than 100 years of history, but it tries to first bring into the narrative that Mexican migration to the US is a century-long process, no? It's a century-long process that has gone through different stages. Some stages characterized more by this process of coming and going, and other stages where a large Mexican community in the US started to form. I'm using here the periods that Jorge Duran and Doug Massey suggest to divide the history of Mexico-US migration, times with the hiring of Mexicans as temporary workers, the enganche would be in Spanish, a time with very important deportations, and a massive migration started. But again, that does not reflect in the number of Mexicans living in the US, and I'm talking about the 20s and 30s. The Bracero program, which has been, I think, the most successful experience of regular channels of migration from Mexico to the US, but that did not have an impact in the total number of Mexicans staying in the US to live. And then, well, we have this period of undocumented migration, which, by the way, coincides with what we saw in this slide of how in 1965 is like sort of a breaking point where migration or the number of foreign-born population in the US increased rapidly. And in Mexico, it started in the 70s. It is related also to the, in the 80s, where after the Bracero program, a long process of migration of flows keep on moving to the US every year without any possibility of returning to Mexico because the Bracero program and temporary options were closed. And then you start this large community of Mexicans living in the US started to grow. It grew rapidly in the 90s, and especially at the turn of this century. In fact, when you look, I'm not presenting the graph here, but when you look at the annual number of Mexicans living towards the US, the largest numbers or figures are in the 2000 and around 2005. Those are the 2 points or years with the highest number of Mexicans leaving the country to move towards the US. And then most recently, in the last decade, you see this as a stabilization of the migration flows that reflects in a stabilization also in the number of Mexicans living in the US. This graph ends in 2015, but if we look at most recent data, the number of Mexicans living in the US today fluctuates around 11 million, not depending on the data source, but it's around 11 million. So we saw this very large increase by the end or the turn of the century. And then we have this discussion on to what extent we have already reached this stable moment in terms of the exchange between both countries. But I would like to say that even though the population or the number of Mexicans living in the US is stable, we have a lot of coming and going, which I will show a little bit in further graphs. The second thing I would like to say is that that also the composition, of course, of this Mexican population has changed in time, and I will also show some examples. And this question of to what extent we have reached a stable moment and migration will not increase in the future. Well, probably that's one of the topics, unsolved questions, and one of the topics for further discussion. Okay, so one of the issues is that this stabilization of the number of Mexicans living in the US happened after the Great Recession, after 2007, 2008, and it has been linked in the literature to the economic recession in the US and to a large return migration during those years, return migration to Mexico. And then in the first, let's say around 10 years ago, we also had this question of how Mexican migration to the US was decreasing, but Central American migration to the US was increasing. And 5 years ago, we had the question of to what extent Central American migrants were replacing Mexican flows. So it all depends on what point of time are you standing and how it looks. In this graph, what I'm putting is the number of new arrivals from US to US from Mexico, which is this line, the dark red line, and from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which is this blue line. So let's say around 2010, the way it looked like is that there was this large increase in Mexican migration. I already mentioned that the year 2000 was the year more Mexicans moved to the US, 725,000, which is a lot. And then that year, we would not have guessed, all the specialists on migration, we would not have guessed that the flow would have changed so much. No, Then we look at the next, what happened on the following years, and it's 2004, but particularly that we got another big point, and then Mexican migration started to fall, no? And at a certain point, and I'm using this graph because in 2014 it was almost close to that of Central American migrants. Now, even though Central migration was increasing, the number of the new arrivals was far from what we have seen before in terms of Mexico. Now, again, from the Mexican perspective, what we are talking about is that close to 9% of the Mexicans born in Mexico live in the US, no? So one of the questions is to think, for us in Mexico, is to think, what does it mean to have 9% of your population living in the neighbor country? And what does that imply in terms of other social and cultural processes? Okay, now it's very interesting because when you look at the data, one of the other things, I know that Mexican and Latin Central American migration still get most of the attention when we talk about migration in the US. But it's interesting to see, as I mentioned, US will remain to be a big magnet, how there has been a change also in terms of the composition of the number of immigrants arriving US every year, and how, for example, Asian migration gained at a certain point. I'm not including the data from the last two years, but at a certain point was even larger, the number of Asian migrants arriving to the US than migrants coming from Hispanic countries, no? So that's also part of the narrative. The other thing is that usually when we think about Mexican and Central American migration, we think about undocumented migration, but in fact, many of the arrivals, and specifically in the case of Mexico-US migration, a large number of the arrivals is related to temporary visas, working visas, and in fact, what we have been seeing for the last 10 years is a very important increase in the number of working visas through the H-1B, H-2A, and H-2B visas that are mainly visas, temporary visas, either for the agricultural sector or to work in services. So I think this data is also important because it says, well, there still remains, and it has been increasing this option for regular migration. And one of the questions that I have not heard in the recent years is to what extent for example, the American labor market would require more of these kind of visas in order to have to promote a legal migration, a temporary migration that responds to the needs of the labor market, and that responds also to the interest of Mexicans that are looking for labor options in the north. Okay, now in general, I think I didn't increase that. I'm sorry, I didn't include the graph on undocumented migration, but in general, it's estimated that around, I was saying that it's around 11 million Mexicans living in the US, and about half of them are undocumented migrants. Now that would be the general estimate. So when we want to think in general with this very basic data on the scenario and the panorama, one of the questions is what will happen with Mexico-US migration, with the number of Mexicans arriving in the US in the future years. To what extent this stabilization that we had seen before the pandemic will remain? But there are some other things that we have learned. There's a strong documented component of migration. And in fact, if you look at migration before the pandemic, before COVID-19, there was a strong documented component of migration, of population moving between both countries with a documented status, either citizens or permanent residents. There is, as I already mentioned, there's a significant increase in the number of temporary workers visa, and a large mobility of Mexican migrants naturalized or with green cards. What is the scenario after COVID-19? So we know that for Mexicans, migration to the US has been historically an option in cases of emergency, of need, and that migration flows change rapidly. So that's one issue. And on the other side, you have this very large community of documented migrants that can move freely without any obstacle between both countries and work in both countries. So to a certain extent, Mexico-US migration cannot be over because there are so many linkages. And it remains to be seen to what extent there will be an increase in the flow. And I'm going to show now some data that is not the actual numbers, but that give indications of what may happen in the next years. So I will talk now about border crossings. Border crossings. So what we have been seeing again after the Great Recession in the US? We saw a change in the composition of the detentions by the Border Patrol and in the Mexico-US border by country of origin. No? So let's say in 2008, there were still important peaks in the number of apprehensions. Mostly the dark color is mostly of people trying to get to the US born in Mexico. And what we have seen in the last decade and a half is a change first in the composition, a larger participation or apprehensions of migrants from other countries. And in 2019, we were still watching a low number of apprehensions of Mexicans and a large number of apprehensions of migrants coming from other countries, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, well, mainly from Guatemala and Honduras. No, this is Guatemala and this is Honduras. Of course, that the data keeps on changing, but what happened during the pandemics? First, we saw a large decrease in the number of apprehensions, but I like this table because it shows, for example, that in 2020, when you look at the total, there was less than half of apprehensions compared to 2019. That's an effect of the pandemic. And we see this large decrease in the number of apprehensions of migrants coming from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Honduras, and from other countries. And some evidence that the number of apprehensions from Mexicans increased. So apprehensions is not actually the number of arrivals to US, but it does give us an initial trend or an initial idea of the number of people trying how the number of people trying to cross the border changed. We know, and we know, for example, again, here we have it by country, and I'm just looking at April, except for 2022, because we don't have the information for April yet. And again, you can see here, for example, that for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, in 2020, as an effect of the pandemic, the number of apprehensions fell drastically. They almost disappeared, and they sort of recover in 2021. In the case of Honduras, a little bit higher than in 2019. In case of Guatemala and El Salvador, the figures are not so close, but we do see an increase in the number of Mexicans. And then you have March of 2022, where we already know that there was this record high number of apprehensions last month, which I'm presenting here. But then you can see that part of these apprehensions also are related to an increase in the number of Mexicans trying to get to the US. And I think that's also important to bear in mind. Again, we don't see that numbers especially high for Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, but for Mexicans and from other flows that I did not include here, migrants coming from other places. And this is part of the changes that we're facing now. So first 2020 with this large decrease, 2021 with this increase, where Mexicans take a large part. Okay, now another large change in terms of the detentions that tells us that migration flows, again, react rapidly to what is happening and imply different things when you talk about the management of migration, have to do on who is migrating and how they are migrating. In this graph, what I am presenting is of the total border apprehensions, how many were, of what proportion were unaccompanied children, what proportion was related to family units, and what proportion refers to adults traveling alone. And again, if you see 2013, you have mainly adults traveling alone. And in 2019, you have mainly family units, no? And the number of unaccompanied migrants, which is unaccompanied children, is important because it has stayed there. It's always there. It has not had the large increases that we saw in 2004 for the first time, but it is there and you can see it all along the period. What happened after the pandemic? This was clear. And this has a lot of implications in terms of the management of migration. Because when you're talking about what's happening in the borders, it's not the same when you're talking about adults traveling alone. And when you're talking about families where you have the mother, the father, and the children, or probably a grandfather or a grandparent, it needs a different type of approach. So right before the pandemic, what we were seeing is this large increase in the number of family units. What happened after the pandemic? So what I'm presenting here is 2020 data, but what the information that we have for 2021, it's similar. And what we can see is that those flows during and after the pandemic is an increase again in the number of, in the proportion of adults traveling alone, which tell us that probably most of this migration is also related to the economic uncertainty, to the need to find ways of support their families in the countries or communities of origin during the pandemic. And it's again a large change in the composition. That although the proportion of adults traveling alone has decreased in 2021 and 2022, it's still higher than before the pandemic. However, I would like to stress that family units remain and unaccompanied minors remain as part of the flow and need, as I mentioned, each of these groups a different type of attention when you talk about what's happening in the Mexico-US border. Okay, so when we were looking at the whole picture, because I want to put it all together, one of the main components has to do with the Mexican population living in the US. I already mentioned that it has not been growing in the past. So because it has not been growing, Mexico still remains as the main country of origin of all the foreign-born population living in the US, no? More than 20%. But as it has remained stable while the other flows have been increasing, it lost some of its proportionality, no? We will have to see what happened with the data this year. But most importantly, there has been a change in the composition of the flows, in the composition of the population, Mexican population living abroad. In this table, I am using, I'm comparing the characteristics of Mexican migrants, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador migrants, and migrants from the rest of Latin America on the Caribbean, and I want to show some well, they are very similar in terms of age composition. Most of the migration is concentrated in labor, in the ages, working ages, no, that's 15 to 64. There's a large difference because Mexican and Central American migration is still concentrated in very low education, less than high school, while the rest of Latin America has a different educational profile. But for me, from this table, the most interesting data has to do with the time of residence. So you're not talking about new arrivals. You're talking then in the case of the Mexicans, more than 80% had lived in the US for more than 10 years. So that means, for example, in terms of return migration, when we were looking at return migration around 2012, 2013, 10 years ago, most of the population that were returning had been away for more than 10 years. So going back to a country that you left 10 years ago implied a lot of challenges in terms of how we integrate and help return migrants to navigate in a system that has changed in health, education, labor, finding housing, etc. And I think that last decade, that was a very large challenge. We'll see what happens in the future. And the other data that is interesting is that the number of citizens among the population, Mexican population and Central American population living in the US remain very low compared to other migrant groups. In this case, for example, with the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, you can see the difference. Okay. Okay, here is the data on undocumented migrants. I did not remember I was here, but as I already mentioned, also related to this process of stabilization in the Mexican population in the US, there was a decrease in the number of undocumented migrants, probably because of the return migration that I already talked about. This did not happen in the case of the Central American migration. And here you can see the changes. The latest data, I didn't update this table, but the latest data, given the complexity of measuring undocumented migration, the latest data we have is for 2019, no? But, okay. Now, well, I already mentioned this. So how has the composition of the Mexican population in US changed? So we have challenges that I think the Mexican government needs to take into account. The first, the mixed statuses within the same family, even brothers and sister siblings who have different statuses depending on whether the parents migrate before or after they were born. A lot of uncertainty around the situation of the dreamers. But we also know that there persist very strong linkages to the communities of origin. And the best example is the number of remittances that, for example, in the Great Recession have a brief fall, but then they recovered to historical heights. We saw also some fluctuation during the pandemic, but then and again some rise. But some academic scholars said that these transnational linkages cannot last forever, cannot last across several generations, and probably will be exhausted in some time. No? So that's, again, an open question to be thought about and to be analyzed in the future. Of course, the main issue, I think, is the status of the more than 5 million undocumented migrants. That's, as I already mentioned, most of them had been away from Mexico for more than 10 years. And other issues is, well, based on what happened between 2009 and 2013, is whether we may see in the future new waves of return migration to Mexico with all the challenges, the integration challenges that I already mentioned also. Okay, now I would like to talk about a flow that we usually talk less about, and that's the US migration coming to Mexico, the migrants moving from US to Mexico. So again, when we saw this data has to do with return migration, and you can see here that migration from Mexico, from US to Mexico, is composed by population born in Mexico, that is return migrants, but also by US migrants, no? US citizens moving to Mexico. And we have always had both kinds of flows, no? At a certain point, I already mentioned the period 2000-2010, basically this return migration refers to after what happened after 2008, that we saw an increase in the number of Mexicans moving back to Mexico. And we saw a very large increase in the number of US citizens moving to Mexico. So in this category, we have a combination of US citizens whose parents, one of their parents or both parents are Mexicans. So they return with their parents and they can move back or move between Mexico and the US because they are usually dual citizens. And then you have a non-negligible number of American citizens moving to, that are whose parents were not Mexican, but that also moved to Mexico. And as I mentioned, this increase is related basically to what happened after the Great Recession. But what we saw with most recent data is that it's a flow that remains. It's not at large, but it remained. And in both cases, and for 2015, 2020, I did not include it in the graph, but it has also had some decrease, but it remains. It's a very good example of how this mobility between the two countries will persist because there are the historical linkages that which they are built on. And because Americans are the main country of origin of foreign-born population living in Mexico. I will show also a graph later on. Okay, so what can we expect in terms of return migration and the migration of American citizens to Mexico? What can we expect? Well, first, it remains to be what happens as a response to the economic crisis. We don't know, for example, because we don't have the information yet, to what extent this large population that arrived in Mexico that were very young 10 years ago, but now they are adults, to what extent they are returning again to the US. We don't know how migrants value the access to health services, both in Mexico and the US. In some cases, some services may be easier to get in the US, but a very important thing that we learned through the pandemic is that care work is important. Who cares, who can take care of me if I'm sick, or if elder parents or children need to be taken care of. And that's also a motivation for migration, especially for population that has documents that can move between both borders. A population that we can think of as a population we share, because they have access to labor, to work, and to education on both sides of the countries. And on the other side, as I already mentioned, family ties. Let us anticipate that migration from US to Mexico will probably remain. Okay, this is the last part of all the components in this story, and had to do on to what extent Mexico is turning or not a receiving country. No, so basically we think of Mexico as a sending country, and it makes sense because, as I already mentioned, close to 10% of its population is living abroad. No, most of them, more than 90% in the US. Although I should also say that Mexico out migration has diversified a little bit. You have Canada, South America, and some European countries receiving also Mexicans. And then there's the question to what extent Mexico, given its geopolitical location, is becoming a receiving country. In fact, Mexico is not a very large receiving country. Less than 1% of the population in Mexico was born abroad. And in 2015, these less than 1% represent 1 million immigrants, of which most of them, as you can see in this table, come from the US. And data from the US Census, from the 2020 Mexican Census, says that it is the same. So even though we have seen a lot of in-transit migration in the last years, even though we get all this attention about migrants in the Mexico-US border, but on the Mexican side, that does not reflect when you look at what the census is telling us about immigrants living in Mexico. Of course, there has been an increase in the 5 years between Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela appears now as the second country of origin, and that has to do with the Venezuelan exodus in Latin America and US and in Mexico. Colombia, but as you see, like Honduras also increased, it more than double, but the numbers are really small. As I already mentioned, considering Americans living in Mexico, it's less than 1% or close to 1%. It's very low. So yeah, in terms of numbers, we have around 1 million migrants living in Mexico. In terms of percentage, it's very low. And I think it does pose a question when you look at the way Mexico is managing this in-transit migration and this increase in the number of applications for refugees or asylum seekers, whether I think that there's still space and place for Mexico to receive more migrants. No? Now, another question has to do with integration into education, health, labor opportunities in a country that has very restrained resources in all those dimensions. So given this would be like a very quick snapshot of the different flows converging and how they look like when you are standing in Mexico. And there are so many questions, I mean, I won't be able to answer all of them, but some has to do, of course, there's the emergency, and usually what we see in the media is the emergency, the humanitarian crisis that we have at the border, and the challenges in terms of the short-term management of migration. But I think it's also very useful to think in the medium and long term, given that the mobility between the two countries will continue in many directions. And as we have seen, migration will keep on being an option in cases of economic crisis, climate events, wars, health problems like the pandemic. And I think that also this discussion of how we manage and to what extent we can think of a shared vision of the border and how we imagine our common border in the near and medium term when we look at migration, not only on what's happening today, but in a longer term, no? And I have only two more slides. One has to do when, three more slides. The first one has to do, again, as I mentioned, we expect, when we look at the projections or the possible scenarios for migration in the future, we expect to have continued migration from Central America and from Mexico, even though there is a demographic convergence in the demographic indicators. For example, fertility in Central America, Mexico, and the US tends to converge. However, we expect certain continued migration. We also see that the reasons for migrating now today are more evidently diversified. We have economic migration, labor migration, mixed with family migration. Violence is a very important driver of migration in the region, and also moves related to environmental events, to droughts, to floods, to hurricanes, etc. And then you also have a combination of social demographic profiles that need to be taken into account when we think about the management of migration. No? As I mentioned, the best example is how you manage children migration, family units compared to forced displacements, for example. Okay. Now, when you look at what's happening in Mexico and in the US, many of the challenges to think about a common management of migration are related to the way the migration systems are organized in both countries. I mean, I suppose I'm not saying anything new when I say that the US needs to revise the refugee and asylum systems, that there's a big backlog, that there's not a rapid response to applications. There is a large population living in the US in a very uncertain status, such as those that have a TPS or DACA. Again, you have this undocumented population who arrived more than 1 decade ago, who's probably, or not probably, who has formed families and has children and is integrated to the American society, but it's in a very vulnerable situation. And then you have this big challenge of how to think on a management of the border with this humanitarian approach. No, I do believe that regular migration, there are options because the US has this large experience and has a lot of options around regular migration that can be taken into account. And then you have the problems in the Mexican migration system. The flows have changed rapidly, and there are a lot of institutional weaknesses. No, some of them have to do with the integration of returning migrants. For example, how they access the health services. We have also found obstacles in terms of enrolling children, US children and Mexican children returning with their parents to the school system. Of course, the management of the borders, there's a lot of institutional issues to be taken that can be improved. The refugee and asylum systems are also overloaded with more applications that what they can process, and with very few human and financial resources. One of the main issues in Mexico in terms of this migratory system had to do with this overlap between the migration routes and the routes of organized crime. And of course, because Mexico does not think of itself as a receiving country, we don't have a lot regarding the integration of migrants to the Mexican society. And basically that is, as I mentioned, it's a very quick snapshot. There are many dimensions to be discussed, but I prefer to look at the questions and then reply to them, or start a discussion around them. So I will stop sharing my presentation And thank you for your patience and interest in this topic.
Dear Silvia, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was a snapshot, quick snapshot, a great presentation for a topic that has so many long and old roots between our two countries. And you really were great in explaining history and actual status and trends. So thank you very much for this presentation. We do have some questions that I will read out to you so you can start answering. So the first question is from Charles Kenny. His question is, I have several questions. One, what are the costs and benefits out migration for Mexico, such as remittances, less pressure regarding employment and services, and brain talent initiative drain? How have successive Mexican administrations viewed out migration as positive and or negative?
Okay, you want me to go one by one?
I think so, because some have to do with Mexican migration to the US and other have to do with US migration to Mexico. So I think it's better to go one by one.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that, that this is a great question. I was analyzing the data for all Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see, for example, that in the case of Jamaica, around 1/3 of the Jamaicans live abroad, no? And for El Salvador is 25%. So that is an invitation to think, what does it mean to have 1 on every 4 Salvadorians living abroad? What kind of idea does it give about the country? And I think that in the case of Mexico, of course, there has been a lot of discussion around remittances and the importance of remittances for local development and the benefits of remittances. At certain points in the history of Mexico, remittances have been the main source of income coming from abroad for Mexico, sometimes even more than tourism or oil. And it sort of builds this narrative that, okay, so migration may be very positive. I have a different view. I think that that as a country, one of the goals would be that migration should be an option with not the very large costs which is now associated to migration for the individuals and for their families, no? For example, we now have more information about mental health or family disintegration, or the separation of the parents, for example, and parents in their older ages who are aging alone because all their children migrated when they were young adults. So there are a lot of costs associated to migration that we need to take into account. When you talk about labor pressure, again, Mexicans, the fertility in Mexico has decreased, is very close to that of the US. In fact, we will publish this year, based on the census data, the new estimates of fertility, and fertility is below replacements, no? That means that Mexican women are having 2 children per woman, and in some of the states, such as Mexico City, is even below that, not close to the fertility rates in Spain or in Italy. And so labor pressure, as the way that we think it in terms of demographic pressure, is not an issue or should not be an issue, because the demographic trend has changed, and that change came at the turn of the century, no? In fact, the population, the young population between 15 and 29 will not be growing in terms of numbers. It will stop growing in the next 6 or 7 years, no? So labor pressure should not be an issue. And again, we have this question that Canada and the US are already facing in terms of the increase of the elder population. So well, that's one way of looking at it. The other has to do, well, Kenny already gave the answer. One of the points that were mentioned that has to do with brain waste, no? For us, or brain, the population, the number of skilled migrants leaving the country. And again, in a very traditional view, it implies a loss, no? A country that has invested, many of them formed in the public educational system, and that moved to other countries, mainly the US in the case of Mexico, because the labor opportunities here are very restrained. So again, I think here we have a challenge, and the challenge has to do in terms of creating the opportunities for these young people and to keep all the talent here, and so that they can contribute to the country. But on the other side, I think that we also have very flexible, talking with colleagues who have moved abroad, we can also have a very flexible approach if you facilitate the process of the population coming and going, no? That leads to this alternative idea of brain circulation. Well, yes, I'm working at this other university in MIT, for example. One of the Mexicans who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, he was working in MIT, and then he returned to Mexico, and he funded here a research center on climate in Mexico. Not so you also have this process of coming and going. The issue is how you design a policy that allows you to benefit from the positive and the potentially positive impacts of migration, and how you mitigate or eradicate the negative costs associated to migration. And I think those two issues are something that has can be modified through public policies. So I don't know if I answered Kenny's question, but that would be my.
I think you did. And because Kenny has other questions, but if he doesn't mind, I am going to read questions from other participants, and then I'll come back to some of the questions that he did. Now we have a question from a US migrant in Mexico, actually. And she says, it appears that US migration to Mexico peaked in the mid-20s before declining somewhat, with data ending in 2018. Do you predict that this declining trend will continue, or that pandemic factors like remote work, the Great Resignation, and early retirement have caused an increase in US to Mexico migration once again?
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, well, especially when you are measuring migration, because it's so difficult to measure in a very short term, especially when you're talking about undocumented migration, we do not have enough data, no? So as I already showed, we have some data suggesting that undocumented migration, Mexican undocumented migration to the US may rise, no? To what extent it may rise to what we saw in the year 2000, that more than 700,000 Mexicans leaving the US. I think it's difficult to repeat that scenarios, no? So I think that we may think of a stabilized scenario with fluctuating. If before the pandemic we were talking about 130,000 Mexicans moving to the US, probably we can see an increase, no? That has to do, and I have to mention it in the case of Mexico, of course, some of these migration may be related to forced displacements, to violence. I mean, we have internal displacements, people moving from Michoacan to the neighboring states, fleeing their communities of origin due to violence, and that would be the case for other states. So I do think that those flows will remain in the short term. In the longer term, I think that, as I mentioned, there are so many ties between Mexico and the US that I would expect that it won't go to zero. The number of people moving from Mexico to the US and vice versa will continue because there are so many ties. And I think that that the person that raised this question adds interesting components, no? So to what extent remote work may be an incentive for Americans to move to some spots where we already have some Americans communities. Let's say these very traditional towns like San Miguel de Allende, Los Álamos in Sonora, which used to be one close to the beach in San Carlos, Sonora. That is something interesting to see in the near future. Not to what extent for some young couples in America or population that is choosing this early retirement, Mexico will become a destination with this process also of coming and going, I should say. That is an interesting hypothesis that we do not have the information now, but it will be something to look into the next years.
Thank you, Silvia. Okay, the next question from Charles Kenny. It appears that there are many people who wish to cross borders into or out of Mexico for many motives. What would a humane yet controlled policy of labor migration into the US look like? If more migrants were allowed in legally, would this reduce illegal migration or would it encourage additional illegal migration? So now you're being asked to write the policy for the government, Silvia.
No, well, again, it's a very good question. Now, what we have seen again in the media, well, we have two turning points, no? When the current Mexican government started, when López Obrador started his administration, he started with a very open discourse around migration, saying that that Mexico would be coherent with the global compact on for a regular, safe, and una migración segura, ordenada y regular, regular, ordered, and safe migration, and that was followed by a peak in the number of Central American migrants moving to Mexico, no? And then it came a change in the way the borders were moved, and the Mexican government sort of keep this, I think it's a little bit schizophrenic, because this double discourse, no? In the international forum, Mexico was one of the conveners of the Global Pact. So it's very assertive in terms of humanitarian protection of migrants, but what's happening in the field does not coincide with this international position. And the second point was what happened after Biden was elected. Now, here I'm moving just as hypothesis. Now we need more time to see exactly what happened. But when Biden started again, we saw a rise in migration. But it has also to do with what happened with the pandemics, because we saw this slowdown or this fall during the first months of the pandemic, and then we saw a rise in general. And we saw this rise. I think that it's very important to consider this rise in the number of Mexicans trying to cross the border, no? Because it's usually we talk more about Haitians and about Central Americans, but you have that number of Mexicans trying to cross the border. And then you have also these other flows, no? For example, the Haitian flow is very interesting because it's a flow that came, many of them came from Brazil, from Chile, from other South American countries. They have migrated from Haiti. For example, in the case of there was this flow from Haiti to Brazil. Many of these Haitians were working at the construction industry when the World Cup and when the Olympics. And then they moved around some other countries in Latin America. And finally, they decided to come to Mexico and try to get to reach the US. And then you have this other flow from Russia and Ukraine that, I mean, we need to wait a little bit to see the numbers, which tell us that this process of migration as a rapid option for people around the world will remain, no? So you have to take into account that it's that you have all these different issues that incentive migration. I usually try to think that it's very difficult when you look at all of them together. So that probably trying to disentangle and respond to certain flows may be more efficient, no? And that has to do with the question about labor migration. So one component of those flows is still this traditional labor migration of young people, probably between 16 and 30 years of age, that are trying to start a family or to raise, to send money to their family that have young children, for example. For this migration, I think that opening regular options and temporary workers visas is a way, no? And not only for Mexicans, there has been some discussion about the expansion or increasing the number of H-1B, 2A, and 2B visas for Central America. I do think that is an option. Increasing the number of temporary worker visas to Canada, which is something that the Canadian government has also been mentioning. And then there is this other issue around cooperation for development as an option to keep people in their places of origin. Because we do have to remember that most of the people prefer to stay in their communities of origin, no? That even though we're talking about large numbers, most of the people decide to stay in the countries of origin, and they will stay in their countries of origin if they have the options. The problem with cooperation for development, which I think that is a way, is that the results will not be seen in the short term, no? That takes a long time, and that we need to consider also what we have learned in the past years for Central America, that it's not only an issue of creating jobs or creating new enterprises or getting access to credits for pushing economic activity at the local level, but that it's also linked to weak institutions in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, with violence, with corruption, with impunity. And so actions in those senses, in those areas, should be also considered when we talk about fostering development in the communities of origin. And again, I don't know if I gave a response, but I do think that increasing the channels for labor migration is an option, even though, or even if it is related with a short term or a brief increase in the flows.
Thank you, Silvia. It was really a very comprehensive answer. So there are other questions, and the other question is, can you speak about the opinions that Mexican nationals hold about migration, both Mexicans immigrating to the US and other immigrants moving to Mexico or moving through Mexico en route to the US?
Yeah, okay. So first I would say that in terms of Mexicans moving abroad, it's very interesting how the opinion and perception around migration has changed in time, no? There's a book that says from the title of a book of a colleague from El Instituto Mora that says something like, from traitors to heroes, no? How first Mexicans moving to the US were sort of look like traitors that leave the country and prefer the American way of living than Mexico and leave their families behind. And then when remittances started being something so important and for families and for communities, how this idea of migrants as heroes was built. And I think that today, when you have all this combination of flows, I think the perception is positive in general, but along with this idea of forced displacements in Mexico, which is something new, there's also this idea of migrants as victims of a system, no? Even if it's economic migration, environmentally driven migration, or migration related to violence in the communities of origin. And on the other part, when you think about migrants in Mexico, that is a little bit more complex. If the person who asks his interest interested, there is this book called Los Otros, The Others, by Pablo Yankelevich, that makes a historical count of the migration system in Mexico and how migrants have been treated by the government and by authorities throughout history. And you can say that Mexicans are not very open to migration in general. There has been periods of history that have been really dark, where there has been rejection, for example, for Chinese migration. And the president, López Obrador, a couple of months ago, asked for forgiveness to the Chinese community in Mexico because there was this slaughter of Chinese migrants in the north during the Mexican Revolution, for example. And there's also this idea, there was this idea about the good migration and the bad migration. No? We know that at certain time, moments in history, the Mexican government was trying to foster a good migration that would be mainly, for example, European migration, and to deter certain migration that was not seen as good or bad, such as the Chinese migration. No? I think that there's also a lot of xenophobia and discrimination in Mexico, and that's why I also think that we need to build a more positive discourse around migration in the country, because for me, it's sort of, again, incoherent, no? When you say somebody's having a negative opinion about a Central American migrant, for example, and then saying that most of his or her family is in the US, no? So I think that we need to move more this idea of empathy in Mexico, given our own history. And secondly, so we have this discrimination surveys that the Mexican government makes every other year. And they do say that Mexicans are not very open to receive international migrants.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you, Silvia. And I think with this answer, Silvia, you actually kind of answered one of the other questions. So I'm just going to read it in case you want to add something to that answer. And it says, there is much appreciation in Mexico of the fact that its historically generous asylum policy has actually been a good thing for Mexico's own economy and society. Think randomly Frida Kahlo, B. Treven, Paco Ignacio Taibo, Carlos Slim, Jacobo Zabludowski, and even the founding faculty of El Colegio. Some of the Russians, Ukrainians, Syrians, Venezuelans, and Africans may actually be people Mexico might want to keep rather than sending on.
Yeah, so no, I think it's a great question, and it gives me space as a person who posed the question knows. My home institution, El Colegio de Mexico, was founded as a response during the Spanish Civil War, when Mexico received an important number of refugees from Spain. Many of them were intellectuals, presidents of universities, researchers, scientists, artists, intellectuals, and Mexico received them with something that started a tradition of political asylum in Mexico. We have this experience with Spain, with after coup d'etat in several Latin American countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, to mention some of them. So I think that's a policy of which Mexico has been very proud of, and where there is a lot of coherence. Now, the numbers in this case, even though it's a very important, and I think it's very significant, as I mentioned, my institution was founded that way. It's the numbers are very small, no? But I do think that if we want to honor that tradition that President Cárdenas started in the 30s, with this very humanitarian approach to refuge and asylum, that's something we can do. Today, I would say again that there's some incoherence, because although there's a political will, And there's a great, la Comisión para el Apoyo a Refugiados is doing a great job. They do not have enough human and financial resources to respond to what is happening right now. So yeah, I think it's very important, and I'm thankful that the person brought it out. But I would also like to say, some people, sometimes I'm on the other side, and I have been criticized for romanticizing this policy in Mexico of receiving asylum seekers and refugees at different points, and saying, well, that's not the norm. But it's not the norm, but it's also part of our story, migration story.
Thank you, Silvia. We have, I think, 3 more questions. One, it says, is there a change of migration flow from the US to Mexico and Mexico to the US related to the change of party in the US government?
So as I already mentioned, the data tells us that the number of apprehensions of Mexicans, which is the closest indicator to the flow, increased in 2021, no? And it reached a historical peak last month. The problem is that we have confounding effects. So we cannot tell to what extent is a response to the change of government and the change in the US narrative, and to what extent is a catch-up after the decrease during the pandemic months, the first months of the pandemic. It's a response to the rising violence in some of the states, and a response to the labor shortages in Mexico, given the way Mexico managed the COVID-19 crisis regarding labor, no? So there's a confounding effect that probably we need more months or a couple of years more to have more precise information to answer that specific question.
Thank you, Silvia. Okay, so just to let you know that Charles Kinney has shared that he is the director of the Center for the Americas at the University of Oklahoma. And his 3rd question is, how would the answers to be similar or different if we're thinking of what Mexico should do in respect to its southern border? And just to remind you, his 2nd question had been about the motives of immigration out of Mexico, and what would happen if more immigrants were allowed.
Well, said frankly, said in a very open and frankly, Mexico was not prepared to receive these flows from crossing through the southern border, no? And also those crossing by airplane, arriving in Mexico through the air. We were not prepared. The migration system is totally surpassed, no? The migration authorities are taking a lot of decisions on the field without a lot of planning on what the migration strategy for arrival through the southern border or by air should be, and yeah, I think there's a lot of incoherence again at the discourse level of what's happening on the ground, and I think that part of what we see at the southern border has to do with this inefficiency and with this lack of clarity regarding the goals or the type of what does it mean to have an orderly and humanitarian approach to border crossings or arrivals by air. And I include the arrivals by air because probably the numbers are smaller, but we also see a lot of irregularities in the way migrants coming from Latin America, and even more recently from other places like in the case of Russian and Ukrainian migration. You know? So in terms of what will happen, So again, it's when you think in terms of the long term or the short term. The problem in Mexico, because I think that, I mean, I'm very critical, but I should say that some positive approaches that have been taken. No, for example, in terms of facilitating the transit visas, or facilitating the applications of refuge here in Mexico after arrival, or facilitating the possibilities to stay in Mexico for longer periods and turn Mexico into the place of destination instead of the in-transit place. So some efforts have been done, and some regular or legal options have been open in that sense. But migrants are not necessarily interested. And I should add, I don't think there's a lot of trust on Mexican institutions, no? So those are some challenges that need to be met if we want to have a more coherent approach to migration and a more orderly management of the border. Again, I think, I didn't bring it, but when you look at the size of the, well, okay, when you look at what's happening with Colombia, Colombia is a very good example. In the period of 5 years, Colombia received more than 2 million Venezuelans, no? 2 million Venezuelans. And from the data I showed you, Mexico has the number of Hondurans arriving in the last 5 years, even though it more than doubled, is 20,000. 20,000 Hondurans, 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia. I think Colombia offers a very good example of alternatives to manage better the migration with neighboring countries, with a humanitarian approach, with an approach that moves and takes into account the integration of migrants, no matter how long they're going to be here. So yes, it may be possible, and I put it in a may be possible, that you see a first peak in the number of migrants trying to come to Mexico, no? It should stabilize and probably decrease, no? And I think that's, in the case of Colombia, we even register some return migration to Venezuela with COVID. That has to do again with people going back to see their families and take care of their families during the health crisis. And that would be it. I think that we have a lot to learn from other Latin American experiences. I already mentioned the Colombian one. There's also Costa Rica as a receiving country of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans. Chile, I mean, it doesn't mean that they have solved it totally, but even when you look at the numbers, the number of migrants arriving Chile, arriving Colombia, arriving Argentina are much larger than the numbers that we have in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Silvia. And I think, if I'm not incorrect, that I have read all of the questions that there are in the chat. This has been an extremely interesting and important presentation. We really appreciate you sharing all of this knowledge and all of your insight, your generosity in answering every question with all of your knowledge. We know that that you have a very busy schedule, so taking this time off your schedule, we know it's a commitment, and we really appreciate it. I hope you have a great afternoon, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon as well. And please remember that we have our next session on Monday. So
Hazel,
everyone, yes.
Hazel, can I say one last thing?
Please do.
No, first, I really would like to thank Winnie and you for the invitation. I think that it's very good to have a space to talk about migration. And the second thing I want to say, given that this talk is in this large initiative of study abroad, that migration, if somebody has opportunity of studying migration at both sides, the destination and the receiving country, it's very important to hear the narratives on both sides and consider the perspectives on both sides. So I think that for me, it's a great opportunity to talk on migration from the perspective of how it looks like from Mexico. So thank you, Winnie and Hazel.
Thank you again, Silvia, and hope you have a great weekend.